Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohel Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast.
Today, we discuss with Tim Buckley, one of our highly respected commentators and expert on the energy field, especially what's happening in policies in Australia. We talk about the investment trends in renewable energy in Australia and the importance of policies, the right policies, right leadership in making those changes happen, and how it can financing can drive innovation and what's happening in Australia. Please join in, find more.
Good morning, team.
Good morning.
I'm quite intrigued with your background, with climate finance, long-term into equity into Citibank. And this is the whole world is looking towards finding money to do clean energy projects. So maybe take me through who you are, what you have been doing.
Sure. I have a background in finance. I worked for 20 plus years. For 17 of those years, I was managing director, head of research at Citigroup. So my background is all about finance, but I was brought into the environmental movement to advise on how environmentalists could better communicate with the finance sector. And it probably came about with the comment I made rather flippantly that as a finance analyst with 20 years experience, I'd never met an environmentalist. I ran a research team of 100 people. I'd never spoken to an environmentalist. So for whatever brilliant efforts the environmental movement was making, the advice and their thinking was not properly communicated in getting through into the finance sector. Finance is very different from the government. It's very different from corporations. So I would argue there are sort of four legs of the stool. You've got the government, corporations, the environmentalists, and the community. So if finance is not hearing from environmentalists, if they're not considering them a key pressure point, when the environmentalists are clearly advocating for the environment, which doesn't have its own voice, then the message isn't getting through. Finance, to me, is a critical power. It's a largely amoral power. Investors must maximize their risk-adjusted returns. They're not allowed to consider non-financial issues when evaluating. They have a sole purpose test is what we describe it in Australia. And a lot of people in finance would like to do the right thing, but their sole purpose is to actually maximize risk-adjusted returns. It's not a cop-out. It's actually a legal requirement in the financial markets, but it does mean we have to think about finance as largely amoral. And the environmental movement has aligned with the environmental social governance movement within finance, but even the ESG movement in finance has to actually look at it the same lens. In other words, how do you show that environmental, social, and governance factors will affect the long-term risk-adjusted returns for their members and for their investors? The message fits with how finance thinks.
Yeah, the return on an investment depends on the cost of the investment, right? Many of today's investments, especially fossil fuel industry, has not paid the total cost, the environmental cost, right? So that's why it gets really tricky because what you take into the cost side, I understand the revenue side that the return must pay for the cost of capital and risk-adjusted cost of capital.
That is the fundamental disconnect. Now, if we try and bring that together, what you've just described is exactly what I think as well, that for finance to actually act on the climate science, we need a price signal. We need to have a price on the pollution. At the moment, when a company like Glencore or Woodside or Santos can externalize all of their pollution onto the environment, onto the community, if they can get away with it, they will. If there is no price signal, no regulatory pressure, they will do it. And they will hide behind, we are serving our investors to maximize our risk-adjusted returns. Now, the fact that if everyone does what they're doing, we have an unlivable planet, we have no economy, we have a dead planet, and so there is no value whatsoever. But remember, the time frame CEO is his tenure or her tenure. unfortunately, you have a stewardship issue where the company and investors are meant to serve the long-term interests, but the remuneration scheme, the whole psyche of the stock market is about short-term returns and annual bonuses and performances. So we do have a governance issue here, and that is the whole framing of the financial markets and the free market, so to speak, is myopically short-term. I think that was best summed up by the ex-governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, when he talked about the tragedy of the horizon. The investor horizon needs to be aligned with the long-term interests, and at the moment it's not. And so if the climate crisis is beyond the time frame of investors, companies and finance won't act appropriately. Environmentalists have to work to enforce change at the government level, to enforce system change. The minute governments move to put a price on carbon, finance will incorporate that price signal and readjust their portfolios. They won't wait for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. A corporation has 20, 30, 40, 50-year life assets. They can't just pivot overnight, but finance can and does pivot overnight. If America introduced a high price on carbon, the way the International Energy Agency has been advocating for a decade, then overnight, the profitability of Exxon and Chevron would drop through the floor. The value of renewable energy assets and energy efficiency would go through the roof. The value of Tesla would go up. The value of Toyota and Ford would go down. The market would respond overnight if that signal came through with credibility and with regulatory or legal certainties. It is simple. We need a price on carbon. And without that, you can't expect finance to actually solve for a dilemma that's not price. So I think you nailed the key question.
Yeah, and also that's top down. And I think there is also hope now going bottom up, because when you are doing a financial internal rate of return, you also have to look at the demand side, right? If your product, the consumer saying, oh, I will not buy your product unless you do this. So there is a bit of pressure as well. So whoever doing the scenario planning, of course, this is not very strong, but can be.
It can be if you are a consumer-facing brand and you think the community is actually galvanized on this as a globally pressing issue. But remember, most of your companies don't have a big consumer brand. And if you're going to boycott Shell service stations and BP service stations, but you're going to drive an internal combustion engine car, you're actually very quickly, within 1 week, going to run out of petrol. Agree. But what the company needs to know is that the consumer preference is going to translate into their voting power. I do think we need to re-exert the power of democracy, and we need voters to understand that the government is meant to serve their interests. That one of my big issues is that if, for example, I'm Australian, the Australian two-party system, both of our largest parties still take massive fossil fuel donations. And that's somehow legal. You have a corruption of our democracy. I would argue that is exactly what's happening around the world. The power of the fossil fuel industry can't be underestimated. They are very profitable. Most of their profits come from externalizing their costs onto consumers. And yet they continue to sow misinformation, disinformation, and climate science denialism because it serves their financial interest. Their short-term self-interest is served by continuing to pollute. If the government believes the taxpayer, the consumer, and the vote are aligned to solve this problem, then the government would put a price on carbon, regulatory pressures or constraints on externalizing pollution, and markets and companies would have to respond. That's why we can't underestimate the power of fossil fuel vested interests to corrupt our media. They have a financial interest in corrupting our media, sowing disinformation and sowing confusion so that the voters don't act in the voters' own interest.
Absolutely. I learned the hard way. I tried to do an electric vehicle project in the Philippines in 2012. And we are preaching, the numbers were right. If you do this shift, you save about $300 million worth of oil each year. Just import. Philippines was importing $8 billion worth of oil during that, which has grown much more now. I remember someone saying, so you're saying that much saving. If I'm in the oil industry, I said, this guy is taking $300 million from our revenue base. Do you realize this is why you're getting all the opposition people are thinking he's going to take my revenue away? I said, yes, of course. That's another way of looking at it, but you're precisely right. The existing stakeholders have to protect what they got, right?
It's all about self-serving, self-interest. And we have the same issue in Australia. The fossil fuel industry imports $30 billion a year of oil and diesel into Australia, and they will protect their own interests. They are protecting $30 billion a year revenue that they extract from the Australian consumer. Is it in Australia's national interest to import $30 billion of oil every year? Categorically not. It would be far better that we use domestic energy sources. Now, what's the obvious domestic energy source? In my country, it's onshore wind and solar. That is why electric vehicles make sense when it comes to national security, when it comes to trade balance. But of course, that's not in Exxon, Chevron, BP, or Shell's interest, or Total's interest. And so those companies are very effective at corrupting my government in Australia, just as they corrupt your government, because it's in their interest to do. They're drug pushers and they're pushing a drug and they want us staying addicted to that drug. For all that Elon Musk is covered in warts, he has actually driven a fundamental transformation of the global transport sector, and BYD in China and CATL of China have absolutely driven a transformation of the global transport industry that is driven by energy security benefits, consumer benefits, but they've done it by selling a better product. They haven't actually done it by convincing the Australian, the American, the Philippine, or the Chinese population that you buy an electric vehicle to save the planet. They've done it because they built a better product, but it has the added benefit that it could help save the planet. Absolutely.
I was driving a Model Y. I bought a Model Y last year, and driving through Lakes Entrance, I remember a few people saying, "Oh, mate, I'm looking at your charging. Tell me how it works." I said, "You can charge from your rooftop solar." How easy is that? That conversation has not taken place, as you said, all the newspaper propaganda and the hydrogen that's going on, right?
We do have to acknowledge that to transform the entire energy system requires a massive investment. Well, the fossil fuel industry has spent the last 50 years building up the infrastructure and getting the government to build the infrastructure so that they can tax us and exploit us for their own private gain. Most of it is private foreign tax haven gain. They don't pay a lot of corporate tax. They're normally billionaires sitting in Switzerland. They don't care about the people of Australia or the people of Asia or even their own children because they feel they're so rich they'll be able to benefit anyway relative to everyone else. But when you're driving a electric vehicle, as you said, if you're an early adopter, there is a upfront cost. You have range anxiety because there's not the recharging infrastructure. Now Australia's reached 8 or 9% penetration of electric vehicle sales. Part of that is because the government is enabling the build out of the recharging infrastructure. And so there was a huge step forward in America this year when Tesla did a deal with the Department of Energy. They normalized the choice of charger. It's a bit like the old VHS versus beta. You have two different technologies competing. That actually slows the adoption. At some point, you can have convergence, and then everyone can use the infrastructure. It's effectively a social good, and then all of a sudden you can take off. So the range anxiety in Australia, in China, in America, it's disappearing before our eyes. And once you get that, the consumer will be left to make a commercial choice, which is the cheaper product, which is the better product. The government will make a choice as well, which is the better product in terms of the national interest. Because of the massive scaling up of electric vehicles in the last 12 months, we've seen the cost of batteries dropping. The cost of a Tesla EV in America is down 22% year on year. So in a time when we're all suffering cost of living crises, the cost of EVs is dropping dramatically. In China, I love looking at what China is doing when it comes to embracing every aspect of the energy transformation that's underway. Their EV penetration of new vehicle sales in 2023 is 34%. They are 5 years ahead of Australia, 5 or 10 years ahead of America And they see this as the biggest investment, employment, and export opportunity for their country. The government is all in, but it's interesting that I think, and there's no coincidence, China is a massive importer of fossil fuels. The corrupting influence of the fossil fuel industry is far less pronounced in China than it is in Australia, where we're the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. And so by definition, the corruption of the fossil fuel industry, the self-interest of the fossil fuel industry is able to corrupt our democracy. In China, President Xi talks about the national interest of China, and it's not in the national interest of China to be addicted to oil any longer than they have to be. And hence why President Xi down, they're embracing the massive energy security benefits, as well as the reindustrialization of the Chinese economy by embracing EVs.
What does the clean energy financing group do in terms of promoting consumer awareness? Are you doing much, or are you just financing projects, right? Tell me about the...
Yeah, certainly. It's important to get that disclaimer out of the way. Philanthropically funded. We have no paid clients, so we have no government funding and no corporate funding. And so I would argue, having worked in finance for most of my career, conflicts of interest are rife everywhere. We have no conflicts of interest because we're not funding renewable energy projects. We're not funding fossil fuel projects, obviously, and we don't have government funding. So I'm able to speak in what I consider to be the Australian national interest. My funders are Australian philanthropists. They believe that the climate crisis is a critical, pressing problem for everyone in Australia, everyone in Asia, everyone in the world. So they want us to work to get the right regulatory framework to actually solve for the climate finance. My organization focuses on the finance bit. We don't do a lot of community engagement. I do a media engagement to raise my profile so that when I'm talking to financiers and the government, they know I do have a public voice. Most of my work is engaging with finance corporates and with government in private under Chatham House rules so that I can feed back to them what I think they need to know. And probably the number one thing I do is actually follow what China is doing and follow what the technology is doing and follow what the global technology is doing. Things like the build out of battery capacity in the world. You mentioned EV adoption is constrained by the supply of charging. The consumer can't buy an EV because they don't have the confidence about the charging. And as you said, it's no coincidence that range anxiety is the number one issue holding people back on buying an EV. If you've got two cars, there is no range anxiety. The one day a year you're going to drive for a long time, or maybe the 5 days a year you drive your car that's still got long range. But the reality is that's being solved before our very eyes now. But the other issue is the scaling up of capacities. We're seeing more battery factories being built in the world today than ever before, which means that there is going to be so much more battery capacity. Therefore, there'll be so much more capacity to build more electric vehicles. That is a collective bet by the global transport industry, the passenger companies like Toyota, like Ford, like GM, like Tesla, they're all building massive factories. They're all underpinning the build out of massive factories so they can transform from the historic product they offer, which was internal combustion engines, to electric vehicles. I'm staggered by the speed of that build out, whether it's in China, Europe, Korea, or the US. I bet the electric vehicle penetration of new car sales next year will be dramatically higher than it is this year, because the amount of product that's coming through the pipeline, the number of EV brands, the volume is just unbelievable. And let me finish with a number. BYD sales in the first 9 months of 2023 are up 76% year on year. So BYD, the biggest EV manufacturer in the world, is almost doubling its output this year, having trebled its production last year. This is a transformation that's happening right now. It's not happening next decade.
Yeah, the amazing speed that Australians are early adopters. I remember 2008, we did not have any solar. Now Australia, we have the largest per capita, almost 1 kilowatt per capita installation, way ahead of Germany, which is about 650 watts. Once the electric car takes off, people understand the simplicity of it and everything else, right? Yes, you will drive for fishing maybe 900 kilometers a day, but then that's not every day. As long as there is a charger somewhere in the middle, you will be right.
Exactly. And it is the convergence, as you're talking about, of the power markets and the transport market and industry. It's the convergence of those three sectors. And I'll probably add a fourth one, the building market as well. Our homes need to be better insulated. Our homes become power generators. We produce power on our roof from solar. We store it in our battery for evening use and charge our electric vehicle during the day from the solar. And so effectively we cut out the oil and gas supply. We move away from having gas connections. 80% of houses in Victoria have gas connections. Minister Lily D'Ambrosio has put in a gas substitution roadmap. It's all about the economic well-being of the consumers of Victoria. Why pay for a gas connection and an electricity connection when by cutting one of them out, you save $1,000 a year? You can rely on your solar to power the majority of your energy needs, which means you use less electricity from the grid. So you pay less for your electricity and you pay nothing because you're no longer buying gas. And then, by the way, you probably will also get better insulation in your house, which means you won't have to do as much air conditioning or heating. So your energy efficiency goes through the roof and your energy bills will drop by thousands of dollars per year. The saving to the average consumer in Australia will be huge. That's the point that Minister Lily D'Ambrosio has embraced. And she's doing that despite pushback from the gas lobby groups who are saying, oh, you're undermining our grip on the Australian consumer. We don't want you doing that. Lily D'Ambrosio, I'll give her a shout out because she's acting in the interest of Victorians. She's acting in the interest of the people that voted for her and voted for her government. And that is what we need. Ministers who actually represent the people of Australia, not Swiss-based billionaires sitting there running a cartel against our national interest and worse, destroying our planet in the process.
I like the passion that you brings in the discussion. Yes, I think that is very much needed because people are confused with choices and there are people deliberately adding fuel to that confusion fire. So then people needs to understand clarity as to what is possible, what is not, and who do we trust. And that's one of the motivation for me to establish this podcast. I was I think driving through Kew, and then the kids were at the street talking about climate change. And I asked one of these little girls saying, where you get your information? Say, oh, from our teacher. Then I realized I used to work for the Asian Development Bank, that I sit all of those high policy places. I know a lot of people, but the teacher definitely don't have that access. Maybe by a podcast or something, I can bring people like yourself into my platform and have a conversation, because conversation helps people to get clarity, right?
And there is a lot of concern, in my view, of misinformation. Where do people get their information from? Now, the problem is my generation gets it traditionally from print media. Rupert Murdoch controls 70% of the print media in Australia, and the average 50, 60, 70-year-old Australian is absolutely confused about climate science, doubting the climate science when 98% of all scientists in the world, and I'll suggest the last 2% are being funded by the fossil fuel industry, but the climate science consensus is 100% clear. They have, if anything, been overly conservative. And there's a brilliant write-up by journalists in America talking about Exxon View. Exxon scientists nailed the climate science 40 years ago. They modeled exactly what is coming out right now. They disclosed that to the Exxon board, and Exxon's board decided to sit on it and to bury it. And they sacked all those scientists, muzzled them. And so 40 years later, everything that Exxon knew about the science is now coming out into the public domain. The scientists are spot on. The problem is the control that Rupert Murdoch has. Murdoch is a cancer on our democracy because he's constantly undermining the climate science and confusing people. Now, the great news, and the point you made, is that most of the younger generations in Australia don't rely on print media. They don't buy newspapers anymore. And so they're relying on social media and they're relying on other sources. That's why I'm talking with you today. Hopefully the younger generation will be nowhere near as confused as their parents and their grandparents. And we see that in their voting patterns. That gives me enormous hope that as my generation and the generation above me dies out, we will actually have a better informed younger generation coming through that will actually vote in alignment with the climate science, in alignment with true knowledge, as opposed to the lies and disinformation and confusion that the Murdoch media is constantly spouting. One of the things I've been delighted by in Australia is the rise of the teal movement, where we have community representatives elected to go and stand in our parliament. I love listening to the teals because they rely on convincing their local community that they will represent their interests in Canberra. The teals do not take any fossil fuel donations like the Greens. The teals don't. We've actually got community representation. One of the things that Zali Steggall, one of the first teals, has done was to try and introduce truth in parliament laws, that our politicians can't knowingly, repeatedly lie. Now, it's interesting, the ALP has not supported that. Why would the Albanese government, which is all about restoring integrity in our federal government, not want politicians held to a truth in parliament law? You could argue it's a restraint on freedom of speech, but these are notionally public servants. They're paid for with our taxes. They are there to serve the people's interests of Australia, and yet they are able to knowingly, repeatedly lie, and there is no repercussions. It's that service of misinformation. It's effectively allowing people like Peter Dutton to repeat all of the misinformation that Rupert Murdoch, through the Australian and the Courier Mail and his various other newspapers, is able to just spout and repeat. And as we saw with Donald Trump, you tell a lie often enough, and there are enough people who are so distracted by, I don't know, cost of living crises or trying to pay for their rent, trying to feed their children, that they just don't have time to sit through the lies. That serves the vested interest groups like Rupert Murdoch and like the fossil fuel industry. And so they're relying on that confusion and that ability to lie and deceive. So I love the fact our regulators, like the Australian Securities Commission, is now calling out greenwash and saying companies and financial institutions can't deceive investors. And so at the end of the day, if our regulators are actually serving the people of Australia, investor deception is exactly what the fossil fuel industry has been doing for a long time. It's great to have our regulators acting in the interest of Australians.
I understand on the climate issues and that macro level, there is a big lie going on, but on something very specific, I thought that accountability was already in place.
It's bizarre that we would expect corporate leaders to speak truthfully. We expect our corporates to, we expect our educators, but we don't expect our politicians to actually speak the truth. They refuse to pass legislation saying that it's not a restraint on freedom of speech. I'm all for democracy. There are points and limits to democracy. I am absolutely against the Nazi flag being flown in Australia. At the end of the day, that is just a symbol of hate. At some point, free speech has to be constrained in the interest of protecting other rights of the Australian people. If a politician lies by accident, if they say something that's not true and it's material, we could have someone like ABC Fact Check say, we've tested it against 5 professors or experts in that area. This statement is false. That's what ABC RMIT Fact Check does. Once ABC or somebody is designated partially to say that was an incorrect statement, the politicians should be held to account to not repeat the lie once it's been made clear that it is a lie. Now, you have to say, why would a politician knowingly, repeatedly lie? It's because they are serving some vested interest, and we know the corrupting influence of fossil fuels. So they're effectively serving their fossil fuel masters when it comes to undermining and denying the climate. So at the end of the day, truth in Parliament would be great. Australian ownership of media would be, to me, something that would be in our national interest. Letting a foreigner control 70% of the print media in this country is an undermining of our democracy. Why do we want an American billionaire controlling the speech and the education and the media of Australia? Because those all go together. We get educated by reading the media, but if the media is full of lies, that doesn't serve our national interest. I would like diversity of ownership of media and a national citizen test. We should have an Australian ownership test on our media and reduce the thresholds of control so that we can't have a situation where one foreign billionaire controls 70% of a news channel in Australia. To me, that just undermines our democracy.
Yes, power accumulates over time. But I hope things will change with decentralizing approaches to everything you just mentioned. I posted something on LinkedIn many years ago. I was furious. I was in a very senior ministerial meeting with a number of different governments, and the issue came up, decarbonization. And I walked out of the meeting saying, no, hang on, we just don't have to decarbonize system. We have to decarbonize people. We have to decarbonize government department officials and everything else, because these are room full of wrong people. They should not be there, right? So I think that's also exactly as you're saying, how do we decarbonize our media and go to the root of it? The ownership is an issue. If one person or a group controls, they can preach whatever they want to do.
You would look at the advertising revenue of major print media houses in Australia. Last time I checked, 8 of the 10 top media advertisers in the Australian Financial Review were fossil fuel companies. Is it any wonder that the Australian Financial Review refuses to outright accept the climate science and keeps publishing the lies of the fossil fuel industry? I've read the Financial Review my entire career. I read it every day, but I have to put a filter on that they are reporting one side of the story. They have some brilliant journalists like Ben Potter, but the chief editor of the Fin Review is a climate science denier. That lens filters through all of the other journalists who don't have the seniority of a Ben Potter to actually call it out. They know that the chief editor is going to, if they don't report the story as he wants it to be reported, unfortunately, that comes back to advertising revenues, as well as a failure of one of the most senior journalists in the Financial Review to actually accept and act on the climate science. And now that to me is a real problem. The fossil fuel interests, the corrupting influence they have on our media, that's the power of money. If we tax them appropriately, the government could have the CSIRO publish independent national interest research papers, which journalists could rely on. Unfortunately, the federal government under the LNP defunded and said to the CSIRO, you have to work with industry. And the biggest funder of the CSIRO, other than the federal government, is the fossil fuel industry. Funding for GISRA, their gas industry research arm, 50% of their funding comes from the fossil fuel industry that they're meant to be evaluating. And so the corruption of the CSIRO is there because they're funding mandate. And that's a corruption of our democracy, a corruption that the LNP has really pushed federally over the last decade. So we've had a systematic gutting of the funding of our universities and key public interest research bodies like the CSIRO that used to be totally trustworthy brands. But when you're being funded 50% by a fossil fuel industry, you are not going to be speaking truth in, and you're not going to be honoring the mandate of the CSIRO, which was set up decades ago to serve the people of Australia.
Yeah, CSIRO invented Wi-Fi, right? And that was sold overseas, right?
It's been a brilliant institution, but it's been corrupted by the fossil fuel industry. And it's been done knowingly by the federal government. The federal government said, oh, we can't afford to fund the CSIRO. You have to go and get industry partnerships. Now, industry partnerships sounds all fair and reasonable. I like the idea that academia isn't sitting in their ivory tower, that they're actually talking to industry and they're talking to community, they're talking to finance, and they're understanding what's really going on in the real world. But when they then have to sing for their supper, they actually have to bring in industry payments. That corrupts the independence of our academics, which is the academic institutions of Australia have been powerful voices for education and to support our democracy. But when you find out they're sponsored by major mining companies and fossil fuel companies, you can see the corruption of their institutions creeping in on a regular basis.
Yeah, when you have private ownership, things do change. I remember living through the SCCV privatization in Victoria. In those days, state-owned, however inefficient we were, people used to value your opinion because of that SCCV logo. But that credibility is not there with any of the privatized companies. As you correctly said, whatever they say gets filtered through the corporate policies. During SCCV days or even old Telecom Australia days, you could say no because it's a public owned, right?
We've been sold the view that privatization improves efficiency, but when we've also been sold what I think has proven to be a lie, that privatization privatizes the profits of that institution. And when we have powerful institutions privatized, then they serve their private master. There is an efficiency dividend, but there is also a loss of public service. We've seen that with the progressive gutting of our federal government public bureaucracy. And now the Albanese government is trying to rebuild it in order to have public servants serve the national interest rather than outsource it to PwC and EY and KPMG. Now, at the end of the day, when you outsource to really expensive private consultants who charge 5 times as much as a public servant would, you might be getting someone who's got greater expertise, but what you're ending up doing is actually getting yes men involved because they will continue to jump on that gravy train. They will serve the person that's paying for them. So they will supply a very detailed report that gives whatever conclusion they know will be what's desired by the paymaster. And so you effectively have over time we've seen a gutting of the Australian public service. I think it's brilliant that we've had PwC exposed for the corruption, the treason, I would argue, PwC has done by selling off insider insights. They were advising the Australian Tax Office and then selling those national secrets to foreign multinationals for their own private enrichment. And to me, that is treason. That is the definition of treason. Now, it's great that's been called out in the public domain, but it's then given the Albanese government the mandate to try and rebuild the knowledge base and the public service of Australia, because public servants will, by definition, act in the national interest. That is the mandate. They're not acting in some private foreign interest. So I know we're a long way from the climate debate, but at the end of the day, it's all part and parcel of if we don't have truth in government, if we don't have truth in media, if we don't have a public service which we can rely on, then where do we get the trust in our community breaks down? I think they all go hand in hand. And whenever I talk to the state governments and the federal government about trying to embrace the decarbonisation, what we're now seeing in Australia is that Queensland and Western Australia are far more able to serve the people of their states. And so when I talk to Minister Penny Sharp in New South Wales, her biggest problem is that the previous LNP has privatised a large part of the power system of New South Wales. She's now got to go in and beg the private foreign superannuation owners of the grid of New South Wales and beg that they actually align with the interests of the people of New South Wales. Whereas in Queensland, the Queensland government, the Palaszczuk government can actually just tell the grid operator, the power generators and the retailers that this is where we're going to accelerate decarbonisation. We're going to embrace the massive investment opportunities and the national interest, the state interest of moving to 80% renewables by 2020. The Palaszczuk government is able to do it because those government-owned entities will do what they're told to do, whereas the private self-interest have a profit maximisation objective. So Western Australia likewise never went through the privatisation that Victoria and New South Wales did. And so Western Australia under the Energy Minister, Bill Johnson, is embracing the massive opportunities of low cost, domestic, zero emissions, renewable energy powered by batteries. The Western Australian economy is now on a path to decarbonisation. And the Minns government in New South Wales is really struggling with that. The legacy of privatisations from 10 to 15 years ago that have really made New South Wales a lagging state when it comes to serving the people and building out the replacement capacity for the electricity system. We know Eraring is at the end of its useful life. We know the Bayswater plant is at the end of its useful life. We know the Vales Point power plant is beyond its end of useful life. But Minister Sharp can't afford to allow Eraring and then Bayswater and then Vales Point to turn off the way Liddell did last year because we don't have the replacement capacity in place. Now, the replacement capacity is not only zero emissions, it's much lower cost than those old coal clunkers. Minister Sharp can't introduce the solutions that are lower cost and better for our people, better for the taxpayers and the voters in New South Wales, because we don't have a system designed to actually allow it. At the end of the day, we've seen the pitfalls of privatization. We saw the benefit in the first 5 or 10 years, but unfortunately, in my view, the benefits of privatization have now been massively outweighed by the entrenched incumbent vested interests not working in the state or the federal or the national interest.
Now the world is getting more complicated. So what do you tell young entrepreneurs or somebody who wants to get into the field, might be very passionate, said, I'm not going to work for the fossil fuel industry, but what could they do to be a climate change champion as a professional?
All of your listeners should be doing is voting. And I don't care which politician they vote for, they should ask them the question, do you accept and act on the climate science? And then they need to do a little bit of research and work out whether that politician is lying to them. Just have a look at their voting record. It's all public domain information, fortunately, for our democracy. And so see whether the politician you're talking to actually done, and that's at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Most people, myself included, have been disenchanted with the voting system in Australia, and that's part of the disinformation. So the number one thing they can do is vote. The number two thing is when they're doing their interviews, they can actually refuse to work for a fossil fuel company, but tell the fossil fuel company, the recruiter for that, I refuse to work for your company because you are destroying our planet and you should be ashamed to work for that company. We need to destroy the license to operate of those companies in our country. And they're already seeing it. Like Woodside is always bitching about the fact that they can't employ young engineers because young engineers accept and want to act on the climate science. Woodside is the biggest fossil fuel company in Australia and refuses to act and align on the science. And so people should refuse to work for Woodside and Santos. And then they should go back home and ask their parents, do you own Woodside shares in your self-managed super? If so, vote against the board of that company or write to the company, tell them you diss the strategy, you just like earning a dividend from a company that's destroying our planet, or divest. There are different things you can do. Go and work for a company that is working towards the solution. Ask, what is the company doing to act on the climate science? If you look at the biggest private investors in renewable energy in the world, it's the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts. They've got plenty of other warts. They don't pay any tax in Australia. I'm not fans of those companies. But when it comes to energy, they are one of the biggest buyers of energy in the world, and they use their balance sheet, their market power for good. It's about talking to any company you work for. What are you doing to act and align on climate science? Because you can work for a renewable energy company or a battery company, or you could become a electrician or a tradesperson and help install distributed solar across Australia, or induction stove cooktops, or solar powered water heaters. There are a million jobs that could be involved. They're the jobs of the future. But working for a Woodside, Santos, Haverty, or BHP, I think we need to get away from it. Mining is not bad. Fossil fuels are bad. Australia is one of the biggest mining countries in the world. We need BHP and Rio to actually work in the national interest to provide the mining products we need for driving the energy transformation globally. But I'm not saying BHP is a good company. The BHP board refuses to invest in decarbonisation. In the last decade, they've invested almost nothing in driving decarbonisation. They're one of the biggest laggards in Australia when it comes to investing in renewable energy. Now, they'll point to signing new power purchase agreements in 2023, but what have they done in the last decade? We've known for a decade the climate emergency is coming. Now, they'll argue, oh, but we sold out of oil and gas. We sold it to Woodside. Sold out of coal. We sold that to South 32. We sold out of steel. We spun off BlueScope. And we just bought Australian Minerals, Oz Minerals. So we're now a big player, an even bigger player in copper. So they've divested themselves of the problem, but divestment in its own right doesn't solve the problem. Woodside is twice as big as it was a year ago because it's got all the assets that BHP didn't want. But Woodside is still a corrupting influence when it comes to the climate science in Australia. So they've made Woodside twice as powerful as it was last year. Divestments achieved absolutely zero impact in driving decarbonisation. So whilst I'm saying mining has to be held to a different account to the fossil fuel industry, I would not want to work for a fossil fuel industry company, but I would want BHP to actually act and lead on the climate science. I want BHP to do value adding in Australia. And we put out a major report about how BHP could embrace electric vehicle mine haulage trucks. Be a leader. Don't be a passenger. BHP is the biggest company in Australia. We can't afford BHP to be a passenger. I would love the BHP CEO and the BHP chair to be climate leaders. But unfortunately, the BHP CEO used to run the coal division of BHP. So I can bet my bottom dollar that anyone that's run a coal mining company for decades does not act and accept on climate science the way they need to. So unfortunately, you need leadership change at BHP for them to be a leader.
Yeah, team, be a leader, not a passenger. I like that. I keep that energy up. I've got lots of ideas from you. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate that.
No, and thank you for keeping up the good work. It's really important, as you said at the start, that we use your voice and your passion to actually educate the people of Australia so that we can get voters informed and then acting and working for solutions. I am really optimistic. I see the solutions coming at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I see the work of what China's doing. China gets a lot of rocks thrown at it, but China is the biggest investor in renewables in the world. They're the biggest investor in EVs in the world. And China's building 20,000 megawatts of new wind and solar every month. So when someone parrots that they're the biggest builder of new coal plants in the world, they need to balance that with the fact that China is 6 times a bigger investor in wind and solar than America is. That's about having the facts rather than half the facts. So really appreciate the work you're doing. Keep it up and keep fighting the good fight.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.